All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Justin's Morning Coffee. I have with me here Ben Weiland. And Ben is a filmmaker and artist from San Diego. And we connected somehow through the magic of the internet. And I thought it might be a good idea to have Ben come on and talk a little bit about his work, documentary filmmaker, working in just phenomenal adventure films, quest type of films. I've seen now two of your pieces, and I thought they were excellent. So thanks for coming, Ben.
Yeah, glad to be here. This is fun.
Okay, so first off, let me just tell everybody how we connected. I got a random email from you where you said, um, "Hey, I watched some of your material on your YouTube channel about story, and check out this film that I made." And the film was called Savoring Joy.
I hold the memory and teaching of my elders close to my heart. It's their wisdom that guided me in the most crucial times in my life. And for my birthday this year, I wanted to do something meaningful.
About the journey, sort of a homeward journey. Beautiful, just wonderfully like beautiful drone footage, sunrise shots, sunset shots, nature shots, and then just this very emotional journey that the subject went on. And I can tell you, as somebody who has tried to make elicit emotion in nonfiction film, it is not easy to do.
And to see that even some of the smallest things are worth going on a big journey for.
You obviously had a great rapport with your subject, and you did an excellent job with it. So, do you want to just kind of say who you are, how you got into film, and what your approach is?
Yeah, totally. I got into filmmaking by accident. I went to graphic design school at Point Loma, Nazarene University, and graduated in 2008. And for about 5 or 6 years, I thought that's kind of my career path, that I know I want to do it because it kind of combines art with some kind of viable career path that could earn a living. So that's kind of what directed me into graphic design. And I fell in love with it. But when I graduated, it was kind of right when the recession was hitting, and I couldn't find any jobs. I couldn't even find an internship around graphic design. So I went to work for my uncle's door and window business and here in Oceanside, and supported him with marketing materials, website design, anything. I did truck deliveries, everything, you name it. And I didn't really, at that point, like my whole dream of doing design as a career collapsed, and I had no more dreams for what I'd do in my life. And so I kind of just settled in like, well, I'm just going to be grateful that I have a job and I'll just kind of plug along, but I had no ambitions or kind of goals really. But during that time, Surfer Magazine had a contest called the Google Earth Challenge, which was about finding remote surf spots in the world on Google Earth and submitting them. And if you win, then they would send you to that location and create a magazine article around it. And so I started looking for places to surf in like Alaska and Iceland and Norway, just because I figured nobody's looking up here. And so if I find anything, it's going to be super unique. I did not win the contest, but my roommate at the time was like, "Hey, you should start a blog and just post what you're finding here." And so I did that. And within about a month, the staff photographer from Surfer Magazine reached out to me. He had found the blog and was like, "Hey, we should plan some trips to these locations that you're finding and write a feature article for the magazine." And I thought it was my roommates playing a prank on me because it kind of fed directly into, my dream. But it was real. And so I took him up on it and we pitched a project to the magazine and they accepted it. And we went to the South Island of New Zealand. And I went as the writer. I had no writing experience, but there wasn't like a high bar to have a writer go on a surf trip for Surfer Magazine. Um, and then one of the surfers on the trip had a camcorder and asked me to film him surfing. And I cut that into a little highlight reel from the trip. And the magazine actually, to my surprise, paid me for it. And I was like, huh, this is interesting. I guess I'll keep doing this. And so I do like 1 or 2 trips a year like that for the magazine. And every trip I would kind of scale up either my equipment or my ability just from learning on YouTube or talking to other people I knew that were in filmmaking, and just try to glean everything I could and slowly build upon everything I had done before. And I was purely just investing my own time and money to do that. Like I wasn't making anything, like probably not even breaking even. And I still had my day job. So that went on for about 4 or 5 years. And then finally I quit my job at my uncle's door and window business and went full time into filmmaking because they had kind of a slow downturn. And so me being like a graphic design marketing guy, I took a leave of absence and never went back because I already had so much work that started to develop out of my filmmaking. And at that time, because I'd only been doing surf adventure films for the magazine, and these were more of like 15 to 20 minute um, trip films that were tied to the article. But because I had only been doing that, all of my work that started to come in was based on that expertise. So I never really did any kind of other video work. It was only in this realm of like adventure travel. And so I did that, and that was probably 8 to 10 years ago that I quit that job and fully went full time into video. And since then, it's just kind of built. And now I make adventure films as an independent filmmaker, and I also do client work for brands that are in the outdoor adventure space.
That's awesome. Yeah, that
Yeah, so the whole thing was kind of unexpected and
yeah.
never planned. I just kind of, whenever the opportunity came by, I just kind of said yes to it and was like, well, if this doesn't work, um, I'll try something different, but like I didn't really have any other vision or goals in my life. So for me, it was just like a no-brainer to go for it.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I've noticed is whatever you do attracts more of that same thing, you know.
Mm,
And when I was breaking into the business, I had the choice between Panavision Woodland Hills, which does bigger movies, and Panavision Hollywood, which does music videos and commercials at the time, you know. And I remember I said, well, I got to try to get in. And Panavision Hollywood had this internship program that you could do, a 2-year internship program. I was like, I'm going to try to get into that. But somehow, through word of mouth on a film that I was a PA on or something, it got, I found out that there was an opening at Woodland Hills and went and applied over there. And as a result, I wound up on movies instead of on music videos, you know, and that changed the course of my life, probably in ways that I don't even know, because I went in that direction, you know. And so, yeah, that is what happens, you know. Like I always say to my students, you know, like if you like it, then do it, you know, like,
mm,
and then because
yeah.
you'll get more of that stuff, you know, like if you kind of think, well, I don't like this, but I'm going to do it anyway. I mean, sure, if you have nothing else, you know, but you
I know. I mean, that's
obviously,
kind of how I felt like I had nothing else at the time. So I was like, well, I might as well try out this crazy experiment and see what happens.
but
And
you know how to surf. You're good at
yeah,
and
yeah,
you probably go on these adventures on would go anyway. You know, this is something a passion.
yeah. I had done that with friends. I'd traveled all over the world. And then my dad's side of the family, they have a lot of background in mountaineering. My grandpa was a climber who had traveled to the Himalayas. He's all over, had lost his toes to frostbite. And so I kind of grew up around that. He would come back from these travels with slideshows and flip through them in the basement projector with all of our cousins there and share stories from these exotic places. And that storytelling captivated me. And so for me, like surfing, the surf world is interesting because you have kind of the performance athletic side of it. You have the professional tour and all that. But then there's also this adventure travel vagabond side of it too, where it's about discovery and exploration. And when I realized that there's places in the Arctic and Alaska and all these remote northern places that you can surf, it felt like these two worlds collided of my family's background in the mountains and then my love of surfing at the beach here in San Diego. And to me, that was like uh, really surprising that those two worlds were kind of one and the same in that specific area. And so that just captured my attention and fascinated me. And I mean, after 10 years, I still am not over it, you know? So yeah, I still
Yeah.
have just as much interest.
It's yeah, I grew up in Mammoth myself. So, I was
Oh
around
yeah.
mountain climbing and skiing and snowboarding and just anything you could think of in the adventure world. And when I was in high school, we would just go on these backpack trips, like we would just, 14, 15, 16 years old, just off for 3 days,
Yeah,
4 days,
yeah.
5 days, 6 days at a time, you know? Uh,
Yeah, it's kind of that question of like, what happens if I just go over this next ridge? Is there
mm,
something crazy over there? Is there a beautiful crystal clear lake? Is there something I've didn't know existed or that no one else has ever really found out about? It's that curiosity. It's the
yes.
same kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, yeah, we used to pore over the topo maps. We would get these maps at the time, like in the ranger station, they would have all these maps, and you'd look and you'd think, okay, there's a trail that goes up over this. This is before GPS, so it's like, okay, we're going to go up over here. We're going to go in at Independence, California. We're going to go over Kearsarge Pass. Then we're going to go through, whatever, Mosquito Flats or something, and then we're going to come out and climb Mount Whitney on the way out and go out Whitney Portal, and we'd tell our parents, okay, this is what we're going to do. And they were just like, okay, we'd gone
That's
for
so cool. I
six.
was I was just driving past last week. That
Yeah.
whole stretch of the 395 is stunning. It's so incredible. But I have
Yeah.
that same feeling like when I'm driving that road, I look up and see all those valleys going up, and I can't help but wonder like what's up there.
Yeah.
And I'm always like telling my wife, like, let's just take a detour and see if we can go up there and see what's there. And she's kind of like, all right, like cool. But I could just spend, months up there exploring around. It's so cool. But yeah, so, traditionally a lot of surf films are purely about riding waves and the performance aspect. But once I started documenting these trips I was going on, I realized like what you're saying, looking at the maps and trying to figure out where you're going and what you're going to pack and how you're going to be out there in the wilderness for 2 weeks or more, that itself is a story that's interesting. And at the time, it hadn't really dawned on me, but just documenting the planning aspect and how the whole trip came together.
Look at how far you can get. You can just hike. You can't access any of this by car.
Oh my God, this place is so insane. Felt its energy.
Was just as much or more fascinating to me as the actual surfing. Because a lot of surf films would just show the surfers when they're actually in the lineup riding waves and there's no context around it really. And so that kind of made me realize that the storytelling aspect is pretty fascinating and powerful. And that put me on the trajectory to learn how to tell a story. Um, and what was cool is like a lot of these trips were in and of themselves already really interesting. But it also led me from like a producing mindset to think about like, how could I arrange a trip that would be really create a compelling story for people to watch and um, yeah, and just appreciate. And so all those kind of elements started coming together. And then I was in Iceland with Chris Burkhardt, who is the staff photographer at the magazine, and we'd been working together for a number of years. And one night we were there with some surfers. We were there for a magazine article, and the Northern Lights came out at night while the waves were good. And we filmed the scene where the guys were surfing under the Northern Lights, and it just felt surreal. It was crazy. And we had also endured a really heavy snowstorm, and it was just a really crazy experience. And when we came back, we had so much footage. There was enough material to make a 40 to 50-minute film. And it just kind of, the whole project scaled and grew, and we ended up putting on a film tour that went all over the US and also went over to Europe, and it was in Tribeca and bunch of film festivals. And so that was also a turning point where I realized, like, wow, these stories actually connect with people outside of surfing that have never surfed in their lives, but they appreciate the storyline, the adventure, and the spirit of these stories. And that was in 2017. So I'm just kind of giving a timeline leading up to how we connected. So as I've kind of gone down that path, I've wanted to learn more and more about storytelling and realize, man, I really don't know very much about how it all works. Like, I've kind of just intuitively been trying to figure it out. And when I came up, well, and then there's kind of the sidebar where I was following Jordan Peterson and watching some of his videos, and that led me to Paul Vanderklay. And on one of his videos, he mentioned that you were kind of in that same space, but bringing a lot of these philosophical contexts or philosophical insights around meaning into filmmaking, and that there's like this new generation of filmmakers coming up that we're approaching from a fresh perspective. And so that led me to find your work. And when I found your work, it was incredibly eye-opening to me because it tapped into a lot of the questions that I had about storytelling that kind of were underneath story structure and why stories exist and characters exist and kind of what they mean and what they're doing and what they're for. And a lot of the books I'd read about storytelling were more looking into the mechanics of it. And so you could kind of look at examples, you could look at some principles, but it felt like it was more on this like higher level. But there wasn't like that level, that foundational level that explains it from a first principles perspective. And so as I was trying to piece all this information together from various storytelling resources, it was always a struggle because you're trying to like connect the dots between them and figure like, okay, well, how does this apply to my project without me just ripping off this certain mechanism, you know? But then when I tapped into what you're putting out, there's like this substrate of understanding of story that kind of naturally just brought new ideas into place and helped me like see the connection between the stories I was telling and the deeper meanings behind them and why certain things would maybe work or not work. And so to give an example with the Savoring Joy film, I'm trying to remember, you had put something out about the symbolism of light and fire and knowledge and how that brings in insight to a story. It's kind of like the burning bush.
The voice in Field of Dreams, Gandalf, the wise old man, all of this stuff has to do with the burning bush moment, So what exactly is the burning bush? Now here's a very interesting icon. This is the Theotokos in Greek Orthodox theology. And within the burning bush, you have the Christ child and the Theotokos, Mary. So what is that about? So there's a sense that call, okay, it has pregnant within it the value of the future. It's like a little seed that says, if you build it, something will manifest. If you go on this journey, something is going to be born out of this. So it's kind of like a little womb, So I think that's why these ancient artists would associate the womb of Mary that contains the seed of the Christ child, the Savior of the world, the ultimate value, the Logos, and the burning bush. So that there's a sense that they're thematically tied together.
Or Gandalf, or the mentor who comes in, right? And I had this idea to introduce the character Milo Fowler in the film staring into a fire as he's about to set off on this journey. and Milo is Navajo. He lives in Salt Lake City, but he's from Page, Arizona on the reservation. And so he's looking into this fire and recounting how he wants to go on a journey back to where he came from to discover the meanings of the traditions that he grew up with and bring them back to his children and to his community. And so I thought symbolically it'd be really interesting to have him looking into a fire as he's reflecting about these things. And then there's a shot, like a very close-up shot of his eye, and you see the fire flickering in his eye. And so I felt like there's a number of layered metaphors or symbols in that spoke to what's happening to the character internally at that moment. And it's a very short thing that probably I wouldn't expect people to really pick up on it. And I don't know. But to me, once I did that, I made that scene as kind of an experiment to test out what you were talking about. And it worked. And I felt like the symbols and the story and the character all aligned together. And it felt like it was a powerful introduction to the film. And I realized that these ideas that you were talking about, they do connect and they do work. And that was another eye-opening moment for me, where I realized, well, if I can start tapping into these deeper symbols and ideas, that there's a lot of storytelling power there.
Yeah. Wow. That's awesome. I think I've shared the same frustration with you a little bit in reading a bunch of, story structure books and stuff of the formula. Like, I could just copy this, I could just, like, it's like a recipe, like I could apply the recipe, but it is a very utilitarian kind of economic argument that they make oftentimes in these screenwriting uh, books, or even like Robert McKee, famous story guru, will say you should put an image system in to your movie, but he doesn't really go into what it's almost as if he thinks it's arbitrary. You just, as long as you keep it consistent within your piece. And my kind of like presupposition or contention is, well, maybe there's some meaning sort of like latent or inherent within the world itself, which when you invoke those things, like you're talking about the fire, the eye, the burning bush, the call to adventure, all those things are symbolically bound up in such a way that it's beyond the understanding of you and I. That's how I would put it. And that's why I think my theory, I guess, is that when you just go ahead and interact with these symbols, you can actually put more into it, or you could say people get more out of it than what you consciously were putting into it, because the symbol is a larger thing that relates to everybody. And so if you operate that way, then you could have this very surreal, odd situation where someone watches one of your pieces and they say, here's what I got out of it. And you can think to yourself, I never even thought of that. But you can also think they were right. So it's not just your mind by itself creating something. It's you tapping into this larger system of meaning that relates to I don't know what you'd say, the collective unconscious or to everybody,
Yeah, it's like we all have this built-in understanding of what these symbols mean, whether we consciously know it or not. And when you do tap into those, you are putting a lot more depth into your storytelling that's kind of leveraging those resources that otherwise wouldn't necessarily be there. And it's maybe like a more compressed or economical way of conveying certain ideas on a deeper or emotional level, maybe. So
Yeah.
yeah, I feel like I'm just on the outset of this journey. But the latest thing that I've seen you working on is is it the Story Mountains, the mountains of,
Yes.
and
The
I
two
think
mountains.
that whole concept is kind of like a compressed symbol, I guess.
let's look at these and see how they kind of plot out on the life cycle. And I do think that the Mountain of Success and Legacy is a very good way of thinking about it in terms of the first half of life questions and the second half of life questions, the notion of taking in at first and then breathing out in the end. And what is the difference between the pursuits of the first half of life and the pursuits of the second half of life?
Because as soon as I saw that, I realized not only does this apply beautifully to storytelling for different genres, but I suddenly realized, wow, this like applies to my own life, you know? And then all of a sudden I could see that my own life through that lens and start thinking about like, what do I want to do in my life and where am I in my life right now and what should I be doing? What should I be focusing on? And it brought a lot of clarity that just felt, just like everything fitting together like this. And that was a crazy experience actually. And I had kind of a similar experience reading Jonathan or Matthew Pageau's book, Language of Creation, where it felt like all these various components kind of clicked together for the first time. And then so with this latest film that I'm working on right now that I'm releasing end of August, it's called The Search for Volcano Island. I incorporated some of those ideas about the two mountains into the film. It's not super explicit, but it does deal with some themes around the different generations going on adventures and kind of what the role of each of those generations is in the adventure story. And so I was thinking about those things as I was making the film, because now I'm 38, I'm about to turn 39. I've been doing this for 10 years, and I got invited on an expedition to the Aleutian Islands in Alaska to explore the region for new waves by these young brothers who are in their mid-20s. And they had seen some of my work from 10 years ago in the region. And so they reached out to me to come with them on their journey. And so I thought, gosh, that's so interesting because they're kind of like on the beginning of that first hill. And then I'm kind of in that gap between the first hill and the second one, right? Like what's coming next for me. And then there's another character in the film, Doc Renneker, who's like a legend of surf exploration, who also makes an appearance in the film.
You have no idea what you're in for. Yeah.
Can you actually get into them?
It was pretty special to meet some of the surf exploration legends that were getting off here. It's these guys that inspired me in my early days.
Doc has seen things that most people couldn't imagine. Just the things he's done with surfing, I guess, and surf exploration. Just where he's been and places that he's sought out surf. And then also, like, back home, I guess, his reputation, just known, like, as a gnarly, burly charger, just fearless kind of guy.
Have your eye on other places. And I said, well, yeah, I want to go to the end of the Aleutians. I wanted to do that all my life, really.
So I was thinking through how all those different generations connect together. We're all in our own place on the timeline, kind of in the same world, but different stages of the story.
Yeah, so I was totally thinking that when I watched your film again this morning. Yeah, because I'm about to put something out that relates specifically to that, because I'm going to do the quest, my lecture on the part 2 of the quest story, and you operate very, very much of all the 7 basic plots, the quest is your archetype. I would say, so real quick, just in case people don't know what the 2 mountains are, this comes from Carl Jung, and the idea is that there's 2 mountains in life. The first mountain is the mountain of success. The second mountain is the mountain of legacy. The first mountain is kind of like you going for it and gathering things in, going on an adventure, accomplishing things. So it's about success, accolades, rewards, having an object of desire and going for it, goals, all that thing. And then the second mountain is when you give back what you took in. So it's like breathing in and breathing out. And it's really more of the mentor role when you get to the second mountain, because now you're thinking about passing things on to the next generation. You're thinking more about the spiritual journey rather than the physical journey, you could say. It operates in the rebirth space, So when in the Hobbit, in the beginning of the Hobbit, when Gandalf comes to Bilbo and says, I want you to go on an adventure, what he's really kind of doing is Gandalf is already on that second mountain. Gandalf is an old gray beard. He's not going to do it himself. Like, he's not going to defeat that dragon that Bilbo goes up against himself. He wants Bilbo to do it, you know? So he's calling Bilbo from that second mountain and saying, okay, you got to go on this adventure. Bilbo climbs up that first mountain, you know, in the Hobbit. By the time you get to the Lord of the Rings, now Bilbo's on the second mountain, and he's the mentor to Frodo, you know. So there's a sense of this mentor protagonist relationship, you know, that if you think of it like the mentor calls the protagonist out of their stasis onto an adventure, and then once you get to the top of that mountain, then you transition now to being a mentor yourself. So you had in your film all of these young guys, totally California, San Diego vibe. I'm a native Californian, so I lived in an adventure, like I said, an adventure place. Like, people go up to Mammoth to go on adventures, and I'm very familiar with that personality, you know. It's just like, let's go for it, let's do it, you know. Just you know, and you guys are going to the ends of the world to surf on top of a wave. So it's like you're getting called out of, like Bilbo, out of the Shire, out of comfort, to the inclement weather and, you know, uncertainty and stuff. And then the reward of it is you're surfing on top of the chaos. You know, you've conquered the chaos. That's like the wave. You know, the ocean is totally unpredictable and chaotic, and yet here you are mastering chaos and the master of your domain. Like, when those surfing sequences are, okay, this is the top of the first mountain. You know, this is it. This is our goal, our object of desire. And then you guys encounter this kind of like archetypal wizardy mentor surfer guy that says, hey, you know, let's get on my boat and let's, you know, and he's really like imparting all of the adventures that he had gone on in the past. You can tell that he's just a super, you know, genuine guy. Yeah, and yeah, so it fits that the two mountains, I think very well. So I think that quest is kind of like there's this little bridge between the first and the second mountain. You know, there's a certain point where you might think, well, I made it, you know, I made it to the top. I remember it with friends of mine who won Olympic medals in snowboarding and things like that, you know. And eventually you're like, okay, you know, I made it. I went on these adventures. Is there more? Is there, you know, and then that's when you start to learn the values, you could say, of the second mountain that complement that go beyond the first mountain.
Yeah, it's an incredible way of looking at it. I mean, I feel the same being in my late 30s now, thinking about, okay, I've gone on all of these travels, made these films. You know, what's next for me? You know, am I going to just keep repeating that same thing over and over again? But it makes me realize, you know, as I look ahead, there needs to be a season where I start pouring back that knowledge into the next generation that's coming up and supporting them and helping them set out on their own journeys. And yeah, I mean, I just realized that through your videos. So yeah, and the film itself for me has been that, is like trying to bring these guys some, you know, attention and visibility for what they're doing. So yeah, it's really crazy when you start to see those things click together and realize, wow, the more you can shape your story along the contours of these ideas and archetypes, the more powerful they seem to be. And I mean, I think I used to have this idea that I want to reinvent the wheel. I want my ideas, my symbols, my metaphors to be completely unique and different. And I want to break the genres. And then I'm just realizing actually, if I do the opposite and really familiarize myself with the genres and learn to master them over time, um, it's a lot more powerful storytelling. You're tapping into something a lot richer. And to me, it's a lot more satisfying doing that than trying to disrupt or break it apart. For some reason, I feel like I grew up always thinking, the creativity is in like how you break it apart.
Mm.
But I don't know. I just see that actually learning them and like building on them is where there's so much more richness to be found. And then, contrary, paradoxically, it's like the more that the films that I've made do have those symbols and metaphors in them, the more they make sense. It's like people connect with them a lot better. Um, it's easier to communicate what your themes are, what your story's about.
Yeah, I
So
mean, you even um there's a sequence in the film where you guys find these artifacts going to the end of the earth, but you find these
yeah, agree
yeah,
coin.
a coin, and so again, like even in going out, going on this adventure, you're still recovering these things from the past. And that very much relates to, I think you're right. Like there's a certain kind of school of thought that thinks that like pushing the envelope and being unique, breaking from the past, breaking the tradition or something is the height of creativity. Um, as opposed to a more of like a Platonic or Socratic notion of remembering, like you're rediscovering meaning, you're rediscovering purpose, you're you're tapping into the source or the headwaters of what it means to be a human or the human condition. And so you guys are going on this journey, like as the young protagonist, the adventure seeking protagonist, and then encountering an old mentor, but also encountering old artifacts from previous civilizations. And so even as you guys are going out, you're discovering this kind of wisdom or treasure involved in your journey.
So I mean, it's all very experimental for me at the moment. I mean, like I said, I part of what I do is like client work for brands and businesses, and then I also carve out time to make my own independent films. I work with a close friend of mine. We have kind of a mini production company. Um, but in the independent films that we make, I just find so much space to explore. And so every project that I put out is kind of an exploration of like, okay, what did I learn from that last one, like Savoring Joy? And then what can I do on this next one to kind of dive a little deeper into it or explore the symbolism and storytelling more fully. Um, so, it's like in the same way I start to see not always are these things planned out. Like the artifacts thing you're mentioning wasn't something I was consciously trying to put in there. But I also see you can analyze it going the other direction and see like, oh, this is why this scene worked, right? And then there's this other scene that I feel like for some reason it doesn't quite work. But what if we put in this visual or this symbol or this mechanic here based on what we know about symbolism or archetypes, and then it kind of solves that scene. And that like experimentation is really fun and satisfying. So I'm like in that phase right now of seeing like, okay, like how do I build on these things and be more intentional with them and um, yeah, just leverage those principles. So
Right.
it's super fun.
This is what I think you do a good job of is, so that you can think of like particularly documentaries having two levels. One is on the level of the anecdote, and the anecdote is like this happened, this happened, this happened. Like we got on a ship, we went here, we went there, we found these waves, um, and then you're doing an excellent job of just viscerally filming them beautifully, just and well composed, great shots. But then there's what does the anecdote mean side of it, There's an old video of Ira Glass who does radio documentaries talking about the difference between the meaning and the anecdote. And usually, if you ask the subject of the documentary, what do you think this means? They will then go into that headspace and they will talk about the meaning. They'll say, this is what it means. Like the subject in Savoring Joy, he started to pontificate on, this is why I'm doing this bike ride. And so you think of like almost anything you do, it's not just for the anecdotal reason. It's like he said, no, what I want to do is I want to connect with my ancestors who lived in this place and tap into that larger collective sense of meaning. And he's the one that framed it seems like, and you are now saying, okay, here, this is kind of like, so you're spacing out intuitively. I think you're probably just doing it naturally. Anecdote, which is very visual and good looking, sunsets and little animals or whatever, drone shots. And then the thought process, here's why I'm doing this. Here's what I think it means. And so that's something that I think is really working for you. That's what generates emotion with people. It's not like, I remember the old ski. What was the guy who did the skiing movies in the
Warren Miller.
Warren Miller, and that was like, let's just see people doing extreme things. And it's mostly just about danger, the visceral kind of, they're doing something very extreme and we're wondering, are they going to make it? Whereas what you're doing is you've developed a creative identity of someone who provides this contemplative, poetic side to the anecdotal experiences, and so I think you're doing a very good job at that. Do you I guess, how do you get your subjects to talk like that?
That is extremely challenging. It's always the toughest part is this is the current process is we'll do interviews, and coming into the project, I'll have a general idea of the structure of the story based on kind of what the concept for the film is. And then we'll document everything, capture all the footage. And then at the end of it, we'll do an interview, like a sit-down interview, and try to explore some of the points that I think will be the most relevant to the story, like voiceover kind of moments. And the voiceover is kind of the backbone that holds it all together. And then it's supported by on-camera speaking from the different characters in the film. And then what happens is, the first interview is not really tapping into things on the level that I'd hope for. But it definitely opens up some ideas for scenes and how this story could be told. And then I'll go back and write a script based off of the interview that tries to condense some of these ideas together. And then we go back with the subject and record the script and try to record it in a way that sounds like a natural interview, like that was given off the cuff, which is really challenging. And then just allow the subject to like interject their own ideas in the flow of it, so it doesn't sound too read or too stilted or too pre-written. And that's the hardest stage, because it is really hard to read something off of script and make it sound like it's just ideas coming into their head at the moment, but that's what kind of gives it a feeling of authenticity. But usually an interview is like long and rambling, and there's not good cut points in between ideas where you can kind of like bring things together. And I've noticed that if you do write these out and have them super condensed, then the lines land with a lot more power. And so it's like finding the balance of the two, because I mean, you could have like a very read script and that's amazing and it works all the time. But for this genre of filmmaking, it's kind of like you want to hear from the subject in this kind of vulnerable, transparent interview style. So that's kind of what I'm shooting for. And
Wow.
it takes multiple attempts at that. It's usually the interview gets a little tired or frustrated throughout the process. So,
Wow,
but
that is a very good idea. Um, I'm gonna present that as an option to my students, I think, in the future.
yeah,
You
I mean,
know?
what I do like in the final stages, will still conduct the interview like it is an interview and I'm asking questions. I ask them to kind of just clear their head, and they've read the answer like 4 or 5 times and they've kind of practiced it. And then I just say like, okay, now just get rid of that, forget about that. And I'm going to ask you the question again and just answer it, how you would answer it. And then it's kind of like organize their thoughts along a certain path of ideas. And then usually it comes off very naturally.
Yeah. Wow. That's great. No,
But I don't know the proper way to do it. Like this is just how we do it.
no, that's a great idea because, a lot of times you get stuck with trying to cut an interview, which isn't exactly right, and having to cut off, right in the middle when they're talking, or they don't exactly say it right, and um and there's definitely nothing inauthentic about condensing something, and people think, no, if it's real, it's going to be off the cuff. It's got to be, but it's like, well, no, it's the same thing they said. We're just the same way as you are packaging this experience rather than just giving me hours of footage for me to watch. You're condensing it through editing, of all of the surfing and everything. You can
Yeah.
do that with the interview too. There's nothing wrong with that. It's still true,
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, that's where it's at the moment. And you know, I always love the on-camera moments the best because they feel very genuine and it feels like you're there with them on the adventure. But when it does come to these narrated moments, I do try to make them more condensed and meaningful and kind of driving the deeper ideas of what's happening. So, and those are so hard to get from sit down interviews, I've found. I mean, I see documentaries all the time where the talking head interviews are just incredible. And I always wonder how they get those. They must have like a very amazing screening process for like who they pick to do the interviews and all that. So,
Yeah. No, it's always a challenge. I mean, especially like if you're working with somebody who's not an actor, I mean, if you get like a pro and they know how to say things on camera and with whatever it is that they do in their career, then yes, but if you get somebody who's a little awkward, it's tough. And that's what I've learned, just one little tip is that if someone tells you the same story that they know you've already heard, they will never, if they're an amateur, they will never say it as well. So
mm.
it's like, hey, tell me what you just told me 5 minutes ago. They'll say,
Yeah.
they just won't do it.
Yeah.
They won't get into it because they
Yeah.
know I've already heard it.
Mm.
And so I've learned like if it's the more kind of like, I guess, a real, just an ordinary person they are, the more you kind of gotta like, don't tell me. Like, don't tell me till
Mm.
I have the camera going.
Mm. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it's never easy, like it's but I think I would say that what you're doing naturally and instinctually is working very well. Your method that you've developed, and I would stick with it. I think um, you're the other thing that you're doing well is providing space for the audience's moments of contemplation. You know,
Mm.
so if you're having, your characters talk, and they might be using abstract language. They might, it's a little bit more poetic. It's a little, and then you're giving us some kind of ethereal music. You're giving us slow motion, drone shots, things like that. Sometimes that needs to sink in and we, the audience, need a little bit of time to process it, to kind of, okay, especially if it's not just, action, 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 like, goal, like you have a goal and then there's an opposition to it and you're moving along that way. When there's a little bit of time to think about it, that is what opens it up to being a contemplative experience for the audience, or a meditative experience for the audience. And what you're doing is you have enough kind of like nature, beauty, material that and then the music that you choose, you can use for those moments. And they feel very natural. Like there's not really a point in any of the two films that I've seen of yours where you're thinking, okay, let's get to the point. It's like you're doing a nice blend of anecdote, contemplation by the subject, and then space for contemplation by the audience, then on to the next anecdote. Like you're doing a nice rhythm of that. And so that it doesn't feel forced. It doesn't feel like there's a lull. It's very, very well done.
Yeah, that, when it comes to the surf scenes, like in The Search for Volcano Island, I was thinking about, you could show a surf scene and it can feel gratuitous in a film like this because you're just seeing people surf for 2 to 3 minutes. And like, how does this fit in with the plot and the story? And so I was trying to think of what role do these scenes play in the story progression and the character progression, and try to make those scenes have a purpose in it. It's not like, hey, okay, now we're going to take a break from the story and we're going to watch some surfing and then we're going to get back to the story. Like the hope is that those scenes can kind of build on what's happening and what's developing. So it's interesting because I definitely started off with films that were mostly surfing with a couple little story tidbits in between the scenes. And now it's kind of going the opposite way where the surf scenes keep getting smaller. But Savoring Joy is a film about bike packing. So there wasn't really that tension of trying to balance it, but there is, scenery of cycling through landscapes and whatnot, and just kind of taking that in. But yeah, I definitely have been learning about the pacing and giving space to breathe, and also space for the audience to try to connect the dots themselves and not just kind of hand them the information on a platter and say like, hey, this is what's happening in this scene, but more of posing questions and giving them room to make their own conclusions throughout the film. So yeah, all these things have been components that I've been learning about. So yeah.
And then you did even I love the animation. Like you had in order to get in order to set the scene, for us to know kind of like how remote you guys are, where you guys are in the world, you put in these little animations that give us the history of the volcano, of the islands, the map of where you're headed to.
It's pretty much a shot in the dark with almost nothing to go off of.
So what are the Aleutian Islands? Between Alaska and Russia, two tectonic plates converge. One subducts under the other, and the force creates a string of over 300 islands, dividing the Bering Sea from the North Pacific Ocean.
Yeah, my last film was called Island X. That came out 2 years ago. And it was a surf film about surfing also in a remote, cold place. And I had some animations in there. And that was kind of I had these little interview snippets from locals on this remote island up in Alaska that were native people. And they kind of talked about the history of the island. And I wanted to include those stories in some way that makes sense. And instead of like weaving it organically into the film, I just decided to like drop them into the middle of the story, almost like a Wes Anderson kind of cutaway mini story within the film, and just animate it so they would be like distinct. And also the animation would bring those recounting stories to life, since we didn't have footage to really build those out. And they're super simple, but I got great response. A lot of people who didn't surf at all but enjoyed the film said they enjoyed the animated scenes the best, and I've always loved animation. So with this one, I wanted to bring a lot more animation into it and kind of just give some visual context for, like you said, where in the world are we? And we did a little test screening of the film with some close friends here locally and found out a lot of people were really confused about what this boat voyage was about, like where it's taking place and the actual extent of it. And as a filmmaker, sometimes it's easy to forget that the audience doesn't know everything you know. And so as we're editing the film, we're creating a story that doesn't necessarily connect all the dots, and we have them connected in our minds because we know, but we don't realize other people don't know. And so that test screening opened up some blind spots in the story. And I'd created a Google form afterwards for people to give some responses to the film afterwards and kind of ask them, like, does everything make sense? What was the most confusing part? What was the most boring part? And that to me kind of highlighted areas that needed work. And so we went back and expanded the animations a lot more to fill in those blanks, to give more context. And it's so interesting, like a lot of storytelling that I've found with these films is just giving people the context of where the story is happening and who the people are. And my gut instinct sometimes is to let's just jump right into the action. But, with Volcano Island, half the film is just setting up the journey. And then the second half is like actually being on the journey. And people are very interested in just being along for the ride for the setup, and I used to think like, well, we just got to get past the introductions, past the setup, and get on the journey, and that's not necessarily the case. So that test screen opened up those insights, and then I just kind of realized that the animations could do some of the lifting on that. So
Yeah.
I drew all the keyframes, and then I had an animator who like actually brought them to life.
Oh, really? Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So those were your drawings,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
the animator. Okay, that's great. That's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I thought it worked great, and I think in order for us to understand, like sometimes you need the setup to understand kind of like the gravity of what they're trying to accomplish, you know. Um, and so I think you're right. Like you do want to show, like if you just went straight to Bilbo fighting the dragon, without all of that, him being like, oh, he had to leave home, then he had to do one challenge, and then he had a bigger challenge, till you finally get to that. You got to really, it's like a symphony, like a song. But like when I used to sing a cappella, in a little quartet in college, if you start full volume, you got nowhere to go.
Right.
Like you got to
Right.
start
Exactly.
soft, and
Yeah.
then you can have the climax where now you're gonna have
Dynamic range.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. That's cool. Yeah. How did you get onto this kind of current exploration of story that you're on?
Um, well, I think I just wanted to know more. I wanted to be like, I remember I took Robert McKee's story seminar just out of grad school. Um, and I read story, I read Into the Woods, I read Save the Cat, and then I went to Art Center for my master's degree. And I was kind of teetering between screenwriting and documentary, and my day job, I'm a camera guy, still that's still my day job. And I just started to drift a little bit more towards nonfiction at that time, and they kind of came together, like the screenwriting and the nonfiction together. But I want to know. I guess I just have more questions than I was getting answers, you
Yeah.
know? And so I started to look. I mean, one of the other things is, growing up Christian and then getting an education in story from a mostly I now know it comes from Carl Jung down to Joseph Campbell to Star Wars to George Lucas, and then Christopher Vogler, who wrote the writer's journey, is Joseph Campbell light or simplified for screenwriters, and that Hollywood is based on this kind of Campbellian Jungian idea of story, but oftentimes they wouldn't really deal with the stories in the Bible that well.
Mm.
They try to fit them in, like, well, it kind of fits the hero's journey like this, or something. And so I just said, well, I'm not quite satisfied with that. I want to know more. And so I ran into the Seven Basic Plots by Christopher Booker, which it sort of, rather than just having one monomyth, which is like the hero's journey, he had 7 archetypes.
Mm.
And so I thought, yeah, that seems right. Like there's, it depends on what you're trying to do, and I was influenced by Nicholas Wolterstorff, who wrote a book called Art and Action, which he wrote in the 80s. He's a philosopher, which basically argues that when you're doing a work of art, you're performing an action in the world. So you're doing something by saying something. So what is it that you're trying to do? And that's really what these archetypes are about, I think, is like Rags to Riches is about the process of going from pure potential to accomplishing something to competence, from potential to competence in the world. Overcoming the monster is about encountering the forces in the world that don't have your best interest in mind. And like that, each of these little kind of archetypes have a purpose or a reason. So depending on what you're trying to do as an artist, as a writer, or as a nonfiction filmmaker, or whatever, I think it would apply to other forms of art too. It could apply to painting or music or whatever. You want to just find out what it is, what the purpose of it is, so that you can kind of align your purpose when you're going off to do the make the work of art. And so I've kind of gravitated to the idea that it's not that you should take the hero's journey and put it into your piece, but that you, the artist, are going on a hero's journey every time you make a work of art, because you're the one who's saying, okay, I have an object of desire, I have a goal, and now here I am stepping into the unknown, and now I'm having to deal with these elements of chaos, things that I didn't expect, and now I'm the one who has to find meaning in this thing. And that is the same process that we go on in life. But as an artist, that's kind of like, that's why I think the people that do best are ones that are honest with that journey that they go on themselves. Like if you won't go on the journey as the writer or the filmmaker, audiences will see the inauthenticity in it. Like you're just forcing it. And so you have to kind of like grow as a person a little bit every time you go and make something. And if you do, then I think that'll translate into a work that represents your little journey that you went on. That's kind of how I'm thinking about it now.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. It's so amazing that all the genres map onto the two mountains, because, I've heard of the basic plots, and to me, in my mind, I would just think of them as like separate buckets that are not interconnected at all. And so you're like, all right, which one? It's like an in and out menu. Like, what am I going to choose? But then when you see that they map onto like, I guess like a meta story maybe, or like a meta contour or something, it's so cool to see that they're all kind of interconnected and they're related to each other. I think that's one of the things that's really blown my mind about you teaching about those stories. The fact that they are interconnected, and when you see the relationships between all of them, you start to realize like what their function actually is. Do you feel like those map onto biblical stories, or because you've explored some of that in some of your posts?
Well, the way that I kind of think about it now is that the the biblical stories are more dense, you could say, than let's say a movie that you watch, you know, they're more kind of like the meaning gets more and more and more and more compacted. And so there's like layers, like levels of analysis that you can use. And there's like basic level, like Christopher Booker says, yeah, Joseph, the story of Joseph is a rags to riches plot. And it's like, yeah, kind of, but it's like so much more than that too. You know, it kind of fits the rags to riches archetype. And I think Jonathan Peugeot has a similar thought process where he says that fairy tales are related to, let's say, the stories in the Bible, but they're not the same, you know, and they're not exactly doing so. There's something about the stories in the Bible that are more like um, I think of it more of as like a lamp that you can use to shine on to the world, but not necessarily like the world itself. You know, it's more like the light. It's like when you're looking at those stories, particularly once you get into the gospel stories, because all of the references start to pile up and pile up and pile up. It's like looking straight into the light, and you're going like, what does it mean? You know, and when really I think what it should be doing is turning it around to look at the world and using it as a light to shine on the world. So I always thought, yeah, like you, J.R.R. Tolkien is a good example of someone who does that kind of well, where you'll find, for example, themes within The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit of priest, king, prophet, but it's not all in one person, you know. And so like theologically, if you look at Christ and you say prophet, priest, and king, I mean, that's a pretty well-known theological analysis of the three roles that Christ has, you know. If you were to say, okay, I'm going to create a character that has all three of those things, you could maybe, you know, but in the case of Tolkien, you can sort of see how these things kind of fan out between Frodo in Lord of the Rings anyway, Frodo, Gandalf, and Aragorn, you know.
Yeah, it's like you're pulling it apart and seeing all these different angles through
Yes.
different characters. And I think you had a post that was so fascinating. I don't remember what exactly it was, but it was about almost taking little snippets from individual biblical stories, and you can make an entire film out of this little facet, say from the story of Joseph. Like that alone could be an entire film, and you had said like it could be this kind of film or that kind of film. And then, you know, within each Bible story, there's enough compression that you could tell like 8 different genres from that one, or maybe 8 different archetypal stories,
Yeah,
which
that's
which is fascinating because it's like a gold mine of storytelling resource.
yeah, it's very compressed. That's, you know, part of the nature of Hebrew, and also the Hebrew writing style is just super, super compressed, you know. And yeah, so I don't know. I tend to think that you shouldn't be trying to take these Bible stories and stuff them into a genre. Rather, you would say, okay, we have these different genres, you know, comedy, tragedy, rebirth, et cetera, et cetera. And that's that's a tool that you can use that comes down to us through culture or whatever. And the biblical stories can inform that. But I found that I was at first, I think, approaching it early on in my career, you know, approaching it the wrong way and trying to fit categories onto the Bible rather than flipping it around and saying that the Bible kind of like shines light on all of our other categories that we have in our lives, you know. And that, I think, it frees it up, because then the whole question of what is a Christian film or not a Christian film and stuff, really what that is just a marketing category. Like, we're making this film for people of faith. And trying to define it like, well, you know, Tolkien is or is not a Christian writer. And it's like, you know, I don't know what to do with that. He was a Catholic guy, and he read a bunch of, mythology, and he wrote this thing, and so it's kind of like, use it as a tool for whatever it is that you're doing, as an illumination tool for whatever it is that you're doing. And don't try to fit into a category that's being imposed. That's kind of how I think about it now.
Oh, it's so cool. I mean, it's kind of an endless gold mine to be mining, like, I mean, just seeing what you're writing about, it feels like just the opening of something completely vast and new to explore. It's
Yeah,
really cool.
I mean, I think what's really exciting about right now is that there are a lot of thinkers who are finally able to transcend the restrictions, the reductive restrictions of scholarship that happened over the last couple hundred years, which is reducing everything down, and taking everything apart. And ultimately this presupposition that nothing means anything except for whatever the writer was trying to accomplish in the world of power. Like I remember a buddy of mine went to Claremont Graduate School over here, and it was getting his PhD in theology over there, and they would go through a story, and they'd say, okay, here's the story. Okay, now based on this, we can tell that there was a power dynamic between the North and the South. And then the reason why they wanted to make it seem like this was a good thing was because they were trying to downplay the narrative of the South versus the North, and they're going through this whole like power dynamic and saying and reducing the whole story down to this power dynamic that whoever it was that wrote that or redacted that put in this for political reasons, basically, and then there's nothing else, and for a long, long time, that's what you'd get when you'd go to scholarship on the Bible. You'd get this kind of like reducing things to these weird power dynamics or political things or whatever. And only a couple of people were saying, let's just look at it like everything means something in there, and let's try to see what it means. And they were obscure people, obscure figures like Robert Alter was in the Jewish world, and he was one of the first ones that would say, no, you can read it from start to end, and you can look for themes, and you can see how those themes play out, and you can look for symbols, and you can see how those symbols play out. For example, the woman at the well. Why is there always a woman at the well? What is femininity and the well have? Why are those always together? And I thought, yeah, why are they always together? What does that mean? But he had to spend his whole time arguing for why that's appropriate to do, and he barely even got around to doing it. So Jonathan Peugeot is really kind of like a continuation of that. I would say the Lord of Spirits guys are like that too. Stephen DeYoung and Andrew Damick. And then in the Reformed world, there's one kind of way far out weird guy named James Jordan who does it. Like there's a few people in the different traditions that have been kind of like doing that type of analysis, I would say. And so I have finally found a way of looking at the Bible that I'm more satisfied with, because it's finally opening up, I would say,
Well, it's really cool. I mean, I came into this whole thing kind of, like I said, through Pajot, Peterson, Vanderklay. And then when I saw what you were doing and connecting it to filmmaking, I was like, wow, kind of similar to like way you can surf in the Arctic, like you can be in the mountains and surfing. It's like, wow, I could be like learning about the biblical stories, like the meaning, the philosophy, and also see how it directly connects to filmmaking. Like this is kind of the best of two worlds colliding. So yeah, I'm super grateful for what you're doing. It's amazing.
Oh, cool, man. Well, I'm just thinking out loud, and moving forward one step at a time. So I'm glad that that you're thinking along with me. So yeah.
Yeah, love it.
Well, cool, man. Well, thanks. This has been great. So how can we see, or where can people see Search for Volcano Island?
Yeah, we have 6 to 7 film events in Southern California coming up in September. And then after that, it's to be seen. I don't really have any distribution locked in yet. I don't have a plan yet. Probably going to do a festival run with it. But I don't really know. I'm just taking it step by step. So yeah, I'm going to be a new dad in October. So
Oh,
just gonna be
congratulations.
focusing on that in October, and then after that, figure out the rest of it. So
Yeah. Cool. Well,
Yeah.
cool, man. I'm glad we connected. I think people are going to absolutely love your films. I can't recommend them enough. You know, you're very talented, and you know, I'm really, really glad to know you.
Yeah, likewise, Justin. So stoked. Thank you.